to welcome you to the 29th Annual Whitehall Lecture Series. Today we host our fourth of 5 lectures in the series, all focused on some of the most sensationalized and headline-grabbing crimes of the Gilded Age. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors of the Whitehall Lecture Series, the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to point out that today we have an online audience joining us. For several years now, the museum has been webcasting these lectures through an online conference room and then archiving the recorded lecture on the Gilded Age History channel. The Gilded Age History channel is available through the museum's homepage. If you visit www.flaglermuseum.us, you'll see an icon for the Gilded Age History channel, and that's where the museum is archiving all of these recorded lectures of the series. Lastly, before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to take a moment to remind you to please silence your cell phones. And I think I caught most of the people in the doorway, but if you got in and got to your seat with an audio tour in your hand, if you'd wave it for me, please, we'll collect that before we get started with the lecture. Anyone? Wonderful. Well, this week we have again with us Harold Schechter. He is a professor of American literature at Queens College, the City University of New York. His essays have appeared in various newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the International Herald Tribune. Among his more than 30 published books are a series of historical true crime narratives about America's most infamous serial killers, a quartet of mystery novels featuring Edgar Allan Poe, and an anthology of American true crime writing published by the Library of America. He's also the editor of the Kent State University Press True Crime History series. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Harold Schechter.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the Flagler and Palm Beach, where I can walk on the sidewalk without fearing I will slip on black ice and die, which has been my experience this past week in New York. I am actually going to begin by reading a poem by Emily Dickinson, part of which serves as the epigraph to my book, Depraved. Dickinson didn't have titles for her poems, as you may know. The first line of the poem is usually considered the title, and this one is therefore called "One Need Not Be a Chamber to be Haunted." One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting external ghost than its interior confronting that cooler host. Far safer through an abbey gallop, the stones a chase, than unarmed one's self-encounter in lonesome place. Ourself behind ourself concealed should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment be horror's least. The body borrows a revolver, he bolts the door, or looking a superior specter, or more. And the key stanza there, for me, ourself behind ourself concealed should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment, be horror's least. You know, Dickinson, who we often think of as this kind of quintessential Victorian spinster, was herself very, very interested in lurid and sensationalistic crime stories that she devoured in the newspapers of her time. And, you know, what this poem is about is this dark, hidden self that all of us conceal even from our own awareness, what the psychologist Carl Jung calls the shadow. And of course, serial killers embody that duality in a very, very striking way. But as a teacher of literature, what's always interested me is why all of us need stories about such criminals. You know, what is it that attracts us to stories about these monsters? And when I first began writing books on serial killers, I really came, you know, I've become, much to my surprise, since this was certainly not a career aspiration of mine, you know, something of an expert on serial murder and so on and so forth. But I came at it not from any kind of criminological background, but really from a literary background. I've always been, I've had a lifelong interest in horror stories and horror movies myself. And I was very interested in, again, why we need stories about monsters. And I was also very interested in why it was that certain criminals achieve a kind of mythic status in the culture. You know, there are all kinds of horrific crimes that take place on a daily basis, as I'm sure you know. I was just reading online a couple of days ago about a woman who was convicted, this just happened last week, of strangling her best friend and who was 8 months pregnant and cutting out the fetus and taking the baby and passing it off as her own. This woman, the perpetrator, had had a miscarriage 3 months earlier. And I venture to guess that nobody here is aware of that crime. I mean, I certainly wasn't aware of it till I happened to stumble on it online. And in many respects, it's a much more horrific crime than, let's say, what Leopold and Loeb did. And yet, you know, Leopold and Loeb, you know, have entered into our cultural mythology. So when I first got involved in writing about serial killers, it was because I discovered that the movies Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and also Silence of the Lambs had all been based on a real, actual criminal, a Wisconsin farmer named Ed Gein. And I began to research that, and I wrote that book. And that book became the first of my true crime books, a book called Deviant. And again, I was very interested in how this real-life criminal was turned into this mythic figure, and the way in which we sometimes understand our experience by assimilating it to certain kinds of story patterns. You know, we turn this crime into a story about this monster who lives, you know, in a remote, off-the-beaten-track house, you know, and lures victims to his death. Anyway, that book was a book called Deviant. And while researching that book, I was in touch with Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch was a famous writer of pulp horror, who was the author of the book Psycho, upon which Hitchcock's masterpiece was based. And in my interviews with Bloch, I asked him why he thought so many people were interested in that particular story. And he said, oh, because they've forgotten Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a 1920s cannibal pedophile. Very, very sensational crime. And that led me to write the second book. And at that time, I got it into my head, for reasons I don't remember, that I wanted to write, the first book was called Deviant, because I felt that a common pattern in horror stories has to do with people who are traveling a straight and narrow path and then deviate from it in some way and end up, you know, in a nightmarish situation. Anyway, it got into my head I wanted to write a trilogy of books beginning with the letter D. Since nobody, as far as I knew, had ever done that before. And there were all these creepy D words. So I ended up writing that book, Deranged. And then I also discovered, through my interest in Robert Bloch, that Robert Bloch had written a novel called American Gothic. And this novel, American Gothic, was based on a criminal that I had not been aware of, Dr. H.H. Holmes of Chicago. And I began to look into that story. And I discovered that very, very little had been written about Holmes since the late 19th century. I mean, there was one cheap paperback book called The Girls in Nightmare House that had come out in the 1950s. And then in the 1970s, somebody published a book, The Torture Doctor, which was really just a bunch of cut and pasted newspaper articles about the Holmes case. I started researching it, and I discovered that there was this incredible mass of material in the newspaper. It was a huge case. I mean, it was the biggest case of its time. I went to the Library of Congress, managed to dig up a lot of material that nobody had seen really in the last 100 years. And I also discovered that there had been another novel written about the Holmes case, a book called The Scarlet Mansion. And The Scarlet Mansion was written by a guy named Alan Eckert, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. And I got in touch with Alan, who was very, very generous, and Through Allan, I was able to make contact with a woman in her 80s named Mildred Kerr. And I'm assuming many of you have read Erik Larson's book, which I will talk about in a moment. So you know that Holmes was ultimately convicted and hanged for the murder of this individual, whose name was Benjamin Peitzel, who was his accomplice. And these are pictures of the Peitzel family. They had 5 children altogether. This is the baby, whoops. This is Nellie and Howard, and got the names of some of them. Well, in any case, Mildred was the granddaughter of Benjamin Peitzel. When I knew her, she was 80 years old, and she had given me these photographs. She bequeathed to me, actually. I have the originals of these. Anyway, so I wrote my book, Depraved, then had my trilogy, Deviant, Deranged, Depraved, which somebody once told me sounded like the title of a really sick Cole Porter song. So anyway, things were moving happily along. Then about 10 years later, I got a phone call. I remember it as a phone call. It might have been an email, but a phone call. A phone call from somebody named Erik Larson, who told me that he had just completed a book on Holmes and wanted permission to use these photographs in his book. And you know, I told him it was really fine with me, but I didn't feel that I had that permission to grant, since these were family photographs who had been given to me by Mildred Kerr. And in the course of the conversation, you know, he said, "Oh, so you're writing a book about Holmes, and you know, I assume you'll be acknowledging my work and so on." And he assured me he would. Anyway, I don't want to get into the whole Devil in the White City thing. I will say, however, well, a couple of things. One is, those of you who have the book and are interested to this extent, if you look at the footnotes, you will find that there are close to 40 references to my book in the footnotes, which I feel is a somewhat excessive use of a secondary source, especially since that's only half the book. Also, well, other things that we will talk about in a moment. I think there are inaccuracies in that book, although I also feel somewhat responsible for having been the source of them. Anyway, I'm going to begin with reading a little bit from the beginning of my book, and then talk about some stuff. In the last quarter of the 19th century, a fiend roamed through America. His career coincided with a remarkable time in the life of our nation, with that era of feverish enterprise and gaudy excess that Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age. Titanic energies were afoot in the land. It was a period of sweeping social change, when our country was burgeoning into an industrial and commercial giant, an American technological wizardry, Bell's telephone, Edison's light bulb, Ford's horseless carriage, was altering the very nature of modern life. Most of all, it was an age when the almighty dollar held sway as never before, and a mania for money-getting, in Mark Twain's words, gripped the soul of America. In place of the military idols of the Civil War, society now worshipped a new breed of hero, the self-made millionaire, the captain of industry, the financial tycoon. P.T. Barnum publicized the rules for success. Andrew Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, and Horatio Alger inspired the youth of America with his rags to riches dreams. Hungry for their share of that dream, enormous tides of humanity swept into the cities, swelling their populations to unprecedented size. The United States, formerly a country of small towns, villages, and farms, became the land of the metropolis: New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit. But of all the sprawling cities, none epitomized the spirit of the age, the expansive growth, raw energy, and driving ambition more completely than Chicago, the gem of the prairie, the most American of American cities, as one awestruck visitor described it. Reduced to ashes by the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago soared back to life like a phoenix, becoming the world's first skyscraper city in 1885 and passing the million mark in population 5 years later. Booming with vigor, heady with pride, flush with opportunity, hog butcher, toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and freight handler to the nation, Chicago served as a colossal magnet, drawing newcomers by the thousands. Pouring out of the countryside in quest of a brighter life, these hopefuls were brimming with spunk and ambition. And this is a quote. "How shall one hymn, let alone suggest, a city as great as this in spirit?" rhapsodized Theodore Dreiser, himself one of the legion of life-hungry dreamers who swarmed to Chicago. The American of this time, this is another quote from Dreiser, the American of this time, native for the most part of endless backwoods communities, was ignorant and gauche. But how ambitious and courageous, such bumptiousness, such assurance. And there was another quality, too, that these migrant throngs possessed. They were full of innocence. Fresh from the provinces, they knew little of the corruptions and perils of the big city, of its dark and brutal underside. For along with the hard-working thousands, the city attracted a very different breed of dweller. Creatures lured to the metropolis not by its sparkling promise, but by its cloaking shadows, not by the availability of work, but by the abundance of prey, not by a hunger for success, but by the smell of blood. For a man of monstrous appetites, Chicago is a land of plenty. It is no wonder, then, that the city became home to the most heinous criminal of the age. Having drifted westward from his birthplace in New England, he arrived in the metropolis in 1886 and, finding it ideal for his purposes, settled in its outskirts. To all outward appearances, he was a quintessential man of his day, possessed of the prodigious energies characteristic of that hustling era. Doctor, druggist, inventor, get-rich-quick schemer, he consecrated himself to the acquisition of wealth. But greed was not what drove him. All the wealth of J.P. Morgan could never have gratified his darkest compulsions. In a booming suburb of Chicago, he erected his stronghold, a place as imposing in its way as Marshall Field's dazzling emporium or the gleaming domes and spires of Chicago's World's Fair, the great white city that would arise on the shores of Lake Michigan within a few years of the monster's arrival. Massively built and bristling with battlements and turrets, the structure served as both business place and residence, though its appearance made it seem more like a medieval fortress. Appropriately, it came to be known as the castle. To the neighborhood residents, the castle was a source of pride, a symbol of the prominence and prosperity of their thriving suburb. Those who were enticed inside, however, and who glimpsed the castle's darkest secrets, acquired a very different impression. But none of them lived to reveal what lay behind the splendid facade. The discrepancy between its outward appearance and inner reality mirrored the nature of the owner himself. But in this sense, too, the lord of the castle was a representative man of his day. After all, in characterizing his time not as a golden but as a gilded age, Mark Twain had meant to emphasize its specious quality. Of course, Mark Twain could never have imagined a place like the castle. Theodore Dreiser couldn't have either, in spite of his deep understanding of the city's sordid underside. It would have taken a writer with a far different sort of imagination to conceive of such a place. It would have taken Edgar Allan Poe. When investigators finally broke into the castle, they were stunned at what they found. A Gothic labyrinth of trapdoors, secret passageways, soundproof vaults, and torture chambers. And then there were the greased chutes, large enough to accommodate a human body, that led down from the living quarters to a cellar equipped with acid vats, a crematorium, a dissecting table, and cases full of gleaming surgical tools. As the true character of the castle's owner came to light, the public struggled to make sense of him. Some saw in him the malignant consequences of Gilded Age rapacity. Others diagnosed him as a case of moral degeneracy, while there were those who spoke in terms of satanic possession. Unacquainted as yet with the language of sociopathology, the American public could only characterize him in the terminology of the day: archfiend, monster, demon. They did not know how else to describe him, since the correct label hadn't yet been invented. In appearance, manner, and enterprise, he was an epitome of his age, but in respect to his psychopathology, he was very much a man of our own, and for that reason, he is of some historic significance. An early edition of the Guinness Book of World Records lists him as, quote, the most prolific murderer known in recent criminal history. In the era of Henry Lee Lucas and John Wayne Gacy, that record has long since been broken, but he holds another distinction that time can never erase. His name was Herman Mudgett, though the world knew him as H.H. Holmes, and he was America's first serial killer. So I have a bunch of things to say about that. One is, I was completely wrong on a number of counts, and I am here today partly to debunk some of the myths that I helped perpetuate. First of all, I have since discovered, and again, I have to forgive myself because I was just beginning to immerse myself in this material, that Holmes was by no means America's first serial killer. First of all, serial killers have probably existed for as long as there has been a human species, and the kinds of crimes that serial killers commit, I might have said this last week too, I don't remember, are rooted in our primate ancestry, really. You know, we're hardwired to commit certain acts of violence. But in America, there were a number of serial killers who predated Holmes. Back in the 1700s, for example, there were a pair of brothers named, well, it's a little unclear if they were brothers or cousins, they called themselves brothers, called the Harps. Herman Melville was very interested in them. There's a reference to them in his novel, The Confidence Man, who went on this very, very savage rampage through Tennessee and Kentucky and Illinois, torturing and murdering a whole bunch of people. 20 years before Holmes, there was a serial sex murderer named Franklin Evans, who murdered and sexually mutilated a bunch of young women. There was in 1875, a guy named Joseph LePage, another serial sex murderer. In 1872, America's youngest serial killer, Jesse Pomeroy, known as the Boston Boy Fiend, killed a bunch of children in Boston and tortured them. So what I'm saying is, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have described Holmes as America's first serial killer. And I think Eric Larson corrects that mistake. I think he calls Holmes America's first urban serial killer. But the other thing that by the time I got to the end of the book, I realized that to some extent, I had fallen victim to the same phenomenon that Holmes' contemporaries fell victim to, and that all of us are subject to, and that I think to some extent partly accounts for a fascination with serial killers, which is that, you know, when we hear about something like this, the crimes are so incomprehensible to us, and they touch something very, very primal in us, that they awaken in us almost this like these childlike terrors. And we have the tendency to transform these very human criminals, I mean very obviously sick and disturbed human criminals, into supernatural monsters. And certain criminals lend themselves to be transformed into these supernatural monsters more easily than others. What I ultimately came to believe, well, let me just say, by the way, Holmes was a serial killer. But by the time I reached the end of my book, I had become convinced that probably he was responsible for the death of 9 people. He murdered Benjamin Pike, and some of these crimes are very, very horrific. He murdered Ben Peitzel and 3 of the Peitzel children. He also apparently murdered 3 women that he was involved with, although it is unclear whether some of those died in the course of his performing illegal abortions on them. And he might have murdered one other person, but I'm not actually sure that anybody was ever murdered in the castle. Nor do I think that it was as even I described it. Here's a picture of the castle, which, as you can see, looks just like a building. And, not even an especially, imposing or formidable one. Here's a newspaper drawing of the quote-unquote castle. After Holmes' crimes were discovered, you can see a bunch of people. Notorious crime scenes have always attracted morbid sightseers, and Holmes's castle did. It was going to be turned, some enterprising person was going to make it into a murder museum at the time Holmes was arrested, but then it burnt down. The interior of the castle, I'm just skipping ahead here, I'll come back to some of these. Well, not sure how. You can see a sort of floor plan of it there, but Holmes apparently was the architecture himself of the castle, which might account for why it was such an incredibly labyrinthine warren of weird rooms and staircases that ended up really going nowhere, and so on and so forth. But what happened was, at the time the reporters and the police finally entered the castle, which was after it had already been discovered that Holmes had murdered Pietzel and his children, public sentiment and near hysteria was already at a fever pitch. It's also important to understand that, again, as with the case I discussed last time, this was at the height of Hearst and Pulitzer yellow journalism, when the standards of journalism, well, it was basically, there was no sense of having to adhere to anything resembling the truth. As opposed to spreading incredibly sensational rumors about crimes and selling more papers. And Holmes was depicted as a modern-day Bluebeard who had lured all these women into his castle and tortured them in these vaults. Because he was a resident of Chicago at the same time as the World's Fair, and because hotel space was at a premium and people did rent out rooms to visitors, there were all these rumors that he had tortured and killed dozens, perhaps hundreds of fairgoers. Of course, you have to realize, somebody who would there was never any report, at any time, by anybody, to the Chicago police that anybody who had gone to visit the fair had disappeared. It's like no family member who said, my father and mother went to visit the fair and they never came back. This notion that hundreds of fairgoers in almost turn of the century, Chicago would suddenly disappear without a trace. Again, part of the mythology. As I said, I myself was caught up in a lot of the most sensationalistic elements of the case. But having said all that, Holmes was a remarkable figure. One of the things that interests me, as I indicated before, is why is it that certain criminals grip our imagination at the time they do? And one answer to that, I think, is that every cultural moment has its dark underside. And every cultural moment produces not only the heroes who embody the highest ideals of that cultural moment, but it also produces certain criminals who embody the worst, darkest, most pathological possibilities of that cultural moment. So I think that, for example, one of the reasons that the Leopold and Loeb case became such a sensation in the 1920s, even though the crime itself was on the scale of crimes, not that, I mean, this isn't the way to condone it, but they abducted and murdered a teenage boy. I mean, there were many, 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 many more horrific crimes at the time. But they became this cultural sensation because the culture saw in them, they were the incarnations of the culture's worst fears about what used to be called flaming youth, these out-of-control, wild kids in the 1920s. In the same way, Charles Manson became the living embodiment of, middle America's worst fears about the counterculture, and so on and so forth. The O.J. Simpson case, had a lot to do with dark anxieties about race and celebrity and so on and so forth. Holmes really was the embodiment of the shadow side of the Gilded Age. He possessed all of the virtues that were worshipped during the Gilded Age. This incredible ambition, this incredible energy, this incredible ingenuity, but he put all that to use in the most criminal way. Holmes was a classic psychopathic con artist who, and here too, I think I am somewhat responsible for misrepresenting this to some extent. I played up Holmes' sexual sadism. Serial killers, as we know them, as we think of them, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, all those people, they're extreme sexual sadists who are driven to commit these atrocities out of this very dark sexual compulsion. For the most part, I do believe that Holmes was driven primarily by greed. And of course, in that sense, it's what made him so fascinating, so appalling to the people of his era. But I also think, to some extent, it's one of the reasons that he fell into obscurity for nearly 100 years, because it was kinds of crimes that somehow didn't continue to speak to the obsessions and the anxieties of succeeding eras. But what Holmes did was, Holmes was ultimately undone by an insurance scam that he concocted with the help of his accomplice, Benjamin Peitzel. They took out a very large insurance policy on Peitzel's name. And the plan was they were going to stage Peitzel's death and collect on this insurance policy. And Holmes assured Peitzel that the way they would do that was Holmes, who was a physician, would get hold of a medical school cadaver, and they would use that cadaver, they would disfigure the cadaver, and arrange it to seem as though Peitzel had had this accident and died in this explosion. But rather than get a substitute corpse, Holmes murdered Peitzel. There are things about, Holmes was an extraordinary man in certain ways. Again, he's one of those people, if he hadn't been a psychopathic criminal, really probably would have been really successful. He then, Peitzel's family, he had a wife, Carrie, 5 children. The wife knew that there was this plan to scam the insurance company, Holmes manipulated her. He was a master manipulator. He manipulated her in this really tragic way. He persuaded her to allow him to take her 15-year-old daughter with him to Philadelphia, where this accident had been staged, so that she would identify the body of her dead father to the insurance company. which happened, and the insurance company did in fact pay up I think it was $10,000 insurance policy, which was quite a large, significant sum in the 1890s. Then Holmes told Carrie that that her husband had to hide out for a while, and he couldn't be reunited with a family, and he persuaded her to give over 2 of the other children to him, and he was going to bring them and reunite them with the father, and then they'd all go to Cincinnati, and they'd all be reunited again. Anyway, Holmes kept moving them from pillar to post, but in the course of those journeys, he murdered the 3 children. His intention, in fact, was to wipe out the entire Pietzel family, and he murdered the 3 children, and he attempted to murder the wife and the remaining children, but that didn't work out. And he was finally captured and tried again for the murder of Benjamin Pietzel. Meanwhile, at that time, all of these stories started being published in the newspapers, in Hearst newspapers, Pulitzer newspapers, claiming that, Holmes was the greatest demon of his age. And they kept digging up supposedly other victims that he had murdered in the course of his career. And when Holmes was finally convicted and sentenced to hang, Hearst offered him $7,500 to write his confession. Now, in those days, this was very, very typical of William Randolph Hearst. And what Hearst would do was he would get one of his own writers to concoct this very, very lurid confession, and then have the criminal put his signature on it. And Holmes's confession was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer and then syndicated around the country. And in it, Holmes confessed to having murdered 27 people, all of whom had been people he had been reported to have killed previously in the newspapers. He was really just confirming, this confession just confirmed all of the wild, lurid rumors that had been published about him up to that point. So again, at the times Holmes died, he was regarded, and the confession is written in this incredible purple prose. In the confession, Holmes talks about how his physiognomy has been changing, and he's begun to resemble more and more the archfiend himself. You look at the pictures of Holmes, he looked the way he always looked, There's some pictures of him. Oh, these are some of his, these are a couple of the female victims that he did murder. These are the kinds of pictures, by the way, that were published at the time. Supposedly, and again, there is no evidence that this is true, although I myself treat it as though it is, but supposedly he killed the 2 little girls by locking them in a steamer trunk and feeding a gas hose into the trunk, and then standing there. As you could see, he sort of very casually, okay, wonder when they'll be dead, waiting for them to die horribly. Now again, there is no doubt that Holmes murdered the 2 girls, no question about that. But the way in which he was portrayed to the public, again, intensified this image of him as the greatest criminal who ever lived. And at the time of his own death, Holmes was actually, one thing about serial murderers is they tend to have had, and nobody has ever been able to find out a great deal about Holmes' upbringing. Although Holmes grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, and I did everything I could to trace his ancestry. And by the way, I think some distant relation of his, a great-great-great-grandson, has just come out with a book claiming that Holmes was actually Jack the Ripper, which is part of this ongoing cottage industry of books that claim a different, to identify Jack the Ripper. One comes out pretty much, every publishing season. There's heavenly music playing. But anyway, what I was going to say was, most serial killers suffer extreme forms of abuse that shade into torture as children. It could be physical, it could be sexual, it could be psychological, it could be all three. They grow up being made to feel utterly powerless. They grow up being made to feel that they are nothing, that they are worthless, and often they will compensate for that, they do compensate for that by exerting this terrible power over their victims, this godlike power over their victims, the power of life and death over their victims. But they also develop a kind of megalomania. They come to see themselves as these supermen. I often think that the character of Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs isn't in any way a realistic portrait of a serial killer, but it's probably a realistic portrait of the way serial killers like to think of themselves, Superman. So when Holmes was going to die, he decided, well, I am now going to achieve everlasting, historical fame as the greatest murderer of all time. And it was one of the reasons that he, was in addition to the $7,500, which Holmes, not so peculiarly, one of the very interesting, bizarre things about some serial killers are family men. They're serial killers who have been seemingly good husbands and fathers, and that was the case with Holmes. Holmes was a bigamist. He married several women without bothering with the nicety of a divorce. But one of his wives, named Myrta, he had a daughter with, and he was always, they separated, but he was always supported her and very generous to her, and he wanted to leave this money to her and the children. But in addition to that, I think that he felt that going down in history as America's greatest murderer was somehow a vindication of his life. And it's the reason, again, why these myths about him have continued to exist. So I want to leave time for questions and answers, and I see we have 14 more minutes to go. So let me ask if there are any, and if not, yes.
Did they ever find the bodies of,
Yes, that's a very good point.
You never mentioned whether,
Yes. Well, what happened was that, they didn't find bodies of any victims in the castle. After the castle was explored when Holmes was arrested, they would find what was immediately, one of the really interesting things to me when I was doing the research is you'd read, the Chicago Tribune of whatever date, and there'd be a big front page headline, human rib cage found in the castle in the basement of Holmes's castle. And then 2 days later, on page 20, in a little thing on the bottom, it would say, investigators have discovered that the rib cage was really, a bunch of wood. However, this man, who was known as America's Sherlock Holmes, was a Chicago detective named Frank Geyer, who ultimately wrote a big book on the Holmes case. Geyer was a very, very fascinating man. Geyer set out on an odyssey to find out what happened to the 3 Peetzel children that Holmes had in his possession. Holmes kept making up, again, one lie after another. That the kids were staying with a cousin of his, that the kids had been reunited with their father, who had taken them to South America, so on and so forth. What Holmes had done in order to cover his trail was embark on this very, very torturous odyssey with the children in his possession that took him to Indianapolis and St. Louis and up to Toronto and back to upstate New York. And he had ended up murdering the children in different places. And Geyer set out on this quest and ended up locating the bodies of all 3 children. He found the two little girls buried in the crawl space of a house in Toronto. One of, I think, the most moving moments in the story, I mean, it was really hard for me even to write, was when Carrie, who had retained this hope that her children were still somehow alive, had to come to Toronto, to identify the extremely decomposed bodies of her two young daughters. And they found the remains of Howard in a stove outside Indianapolis. Holmes had killed him and attempted to had incinerated the body in a stove. So those bodies were found. The other bodies were never located. Supposedly, and this might possibly be the case, some of the women that Holmes killed ended up as anatomical specimens. Holmes did have working for him a man who knew how to mount animal skeletons, and supposedly a couple of the women who he killed, mistresses of his, who again may have died during botched abortions, were turned into medical school skeletons. Although that, again, it's hard to know, given all the rumors swirling around the case, whether that was true or not. But the only bodies that were ever, Peitzel, of course, So Ben Peitzel and the three children, those are the only bodies of Holmes' victims that we know definitively existed. Yes?
How specifically did Holmes kill his victims? And the other part of my question is, when he built his home, he had to use contractors to build the house.
Yeah.
Weren't they able to identify some strange
Yeah.
suspicions about the construction from the contractors?
Well, I was actually, if I'd had time, going to read a little about that. But, Holmes would apparently hire people to build one little, door frame or whatever, and then fire them. There wasn't anybody, apparently, who was involved. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of workmen, apparently, who worked on the house. And none of them, apparently, was hired to construct more than a very, very small portion of it. So apparently there was nobody who really had any sense of how bizarre and Byzantine and labyrinthine the interior was. In terms of your other question, we don't know for sure. I mean, Ben Peitzel was apparently killed with chloroform. And in fact, so supposedly were some of Holmes's other victims. He seemed to employ chloroform a lot to kill his victims. I mean, again, there are all these stories that he did have a very large vault that was built into his castle. And there were stories, again, that when investigators finally examined the place, they found bloody hand marks and so on in the vault. And there were all these rumors that, he had locked victims in there and killed them, suffocated them. There are all these stories that there were, and again, plead guilty to perpetuating, stories that some of the rooms in the castle were airtight and had, gas vents attached to them, which Holmes could control from his office. I myself am not so sure about that. So.
You said he was married, right?
Say it again.
You said he was married, right?
He was married to two or three women.
Right.
Yeah.
But I assume that none of his wives lived at the castle?
No. Murda was the only wife who he was involved with at the time of the castle, and they were separated at that time. She went to live with her parents in a suburb. The first wife he had been wed to was a very young man in New Hampshire. And the third wife, he had already left Chicago, or took her with her when he left Chicago. So none of them ever lived in the castle.
Question
Yes.
How was he apprehended? You said that due to the fact that...
Yeah. Well, he was apprehended because, right from the start, there were suspicions among the insurance people that this thing had been set up. They ended up paying the policy partly because Carrie herself was such a pathetic figure that I know this sounds hard to believe, but, you know, the insurance company felt this human, you know, sort of empathy for her. And partly because, again, there was some ambiguity. They figured they'd just resolve it. But there was one insurance investigator, you know, who was, did you ever see the movie Double Indemnity? Remember Edward G. Robinson? You know, there was one of these bulldog investigators, you know, who kept being convinced, you know, that this had all been set up and that Holmes was behind it all. And they began to investigate, it happened in Philadelphia, where they began to investigate Holmes' background in Chicago. And they discovered, you know, obviously you've compressed the story. You know, Holmes was involved in all kinds of frauds and scams in Chicago. It's one of the reasons, the main reason he finally fled Chicago. So the more they learned about Holmes, you know, the more convinced they became that he was responsible for this. And then they became convinced that he had done away with the children. I mean, it was really the discovery of the children's bodies that doomed him. Yes?
Where is Holmes buried?
Holmes is buried in Philadelphia, and he asked that his body be encased in concrete, which was interesting, because he was afraid at some point it might be exhumed for some reason, either by curiosity seekers or, you know, he himself had been involved in the illegal exhumation of corpses for medical dissection, so that might have played into the decision too. So, yes?
Were all of these serial murderers of superior intellect?
I'm sorry, could you?
Were all of these killers of superior intellect?
Say it again.
Superior
intellect?
Serial killers.
All serial killers? No, by no means. No, most serial killers have very average, you know, they're a little probably above average. The thing, again, that defines a serial killer is they are what we now call, well, there are new terms actually, but they're psychopaths. You know, they're not psychotic. Psychotics are people who are suffering this extreme break from reality. You know, they hear voices, they have hallucinations, so on and so forth. The psychopath, you know, is a person of above average intelligence and rational behavior and, you know, seeming normality, who is devoid of human conscience or the ability to feel empathy for another human being, and who employs his rationality to these very malignant ends, you know, sees other people as objects to be exploited for his own gratification. Not all psychopaths are criminals, but you know, when you talk about a criminal psychopath, that's what you're talking about. But you know, they're not. I mean, there have been a number of very bright serial killers like Ted Bundy, you know, but the average serial killer, you know, and the average serial killer, by the way, there's one on the loose now, where I have a home on the North Fork of Long Island. You know, the average serial killer is a guy who will murder a bunch of inner city prostitutes, you know, and dump their corpses, you know, in this case on a beach or something. You know, they're sexual sadists, but and they're cunning and intelligent, but they're not no geniuses. Yes.
Do you know if there's a brain chemistry component to our obsession with
Yeah.
these murders?
Oh, with our
With our own obsession. I mean, are we addicted to
Yeah.
this ourselves?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think, you know, Plato, there's a quote from Plato in the Republic. Plato says, "The virtuous man dreams what the wicked man does." And, you know, I mean, I think all of us, again, my background is in Jungian psychology. You know, Jung talks about the shadow self. I think all of us, you know, do have dark, lawless, taboo, socially unacceptable dreams and fantasies, which often we don't even acknowledge to ourselves. You know, and reading about this material is a safe, socially acceptable way of ventilating some of those impulses. So, yeah. I think, by the way, if I may say so, you know, I've read a bunch of Larson's books. I think he's a good writer. I've had issues with him, but anyway. But I mean, I think Larson did something very, very, very clever with his book, which was by linking the case of Holmes to the story of the construction of the World's Fair. He sort of made serial killer stuff, acceptable. He made reading this kind of material acceptable to like a suburban book club. He gave it a kind of respectability, So, but I do think, if you look at so much of what we consume has to do with violence, and we're violent creatures.
Is there any difference between violent children, teenagers doing violent video games and adults reading serial killers?
Not at all. I have a book that I might want to recommend to you that I wrote. But I wrote a book a few years ago called Savage Pastimes, which is about the history of violent entertainment. And my argument there is actually that we become much, much more civilized, because it wasn't really that very long ago that a form of entertainment would have been to go out on a Sunday and see a public execution. Sometimes, with the victim being tortured in horrific ways. If you look, people don't have a lot of historical memory for this popular culture of the past. I see violent video games as actually a sign of how civilized we've become. Because now we don't have to actually see real people getting killed in order to, be entertained. We've reached a point. I remember seeing the movie. Anybody see the movie The Perfect Storm? At the end of The Perfect Storm, it says at the end, no fish were killed in the making of this movie. And to me, the fact that we now live in an age where we can't even kill a fish to make a movie, whereas not so long ago, when Errol Flynn made charge of the Life Brigade, they were killing dozens and dozens of horses, just to get an exciting charge. I think we're more and more and more and more civilized. So, anyway, I recommend my book. Yeah.
Two questions. First question is, do you know the year that the photo of the first slide you had? And then second question is, do you know the exact location of his home, the castle in Chicago, and in the suburbs?
Well, the castle? Is that what you're asking, the location of the castle?
Location of the castle, and then you said he was also in the suburbs?
Well, at that time, the castle was built in Englewood, Colorado, which at that time was not yet incorporated into the city. It's now located in what is, I haven't been there for years, but certainly when I was there, it was a very, 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 very bad and dangerous part of South Chicago. In fact, and it doesn't stand anymore. I mean, it burnt down. It's long been gone. I mean, I think, I went to visit it. I think it's, a grocery store or something now, so.
One more.
Yeah. One more question? No? Okay, well, thank you very much.